They expected an inheritance. They got a final judgment. Now the quiet wife holds the key to their fortune and their ruin. The air in the mahogany-paneled law office hung thick and stale, smelling faintly of old paper and expensive, unused leather. I sat in the third row, a deliberate choice, not wanting to look like I belonged anywhere near the ornate desk where Mr. Henderson, my late husband's lawyer, sat perched like a judgmental owl. My children, my perfect children, occupied the front row, a tableau of carefully curated grief. There was Julian, the eldest, a venture capitalist whose tailored suit probably cost more than my entire mortgage. Beside him sat Clara, the renowned neurosurgeon, her expression a mask of dignified sorrow that didn't quite hide the sharpness in her eyes. They were everything Robert and I had ever strived for them to be: successful, polished, utterly self-sufficient, and utterly absent from my life for the last 5 years. It was Robert's will reading. Robert, who hadn't looked at me the same way since I stopped being the trophy wife and started being just me. A little quieter, a little more tired, a lot more invested in the garden than in the next gala. Julian shifted impatiently, tapping a silver pen against his knee. "Mr. Henderson, if we could expedite this, I have an urgent call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. Clara shot him a withering glance. "Show some respect, Julian. Father has only been gone a month." "Respect is relative, Clara," Julian muttered, loud enough for me to hear, a familiar jab. They treated me like the furniture. Present, necessary for domestic operations, but easily overlooked. They assumed quite correctly that Robert's estate, the sprawling estate, the majority of the shares in Henderson and Sons Holdings, would be split evenly among them. Why wouldn't it? I was merely the custodian of the home, the provider of Sunday dinners, the silent partner in their upward trajectory. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound magnified in the tense silence. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes flicking over the parchment. "We are all assembled here today to formally execute the final will and testament of Robert Alistair Vance, dated October 12th of last year. He began with the expected bequests, charitable donations, smaller monetary gifts to longtime employees. The air grew tighter with anticipation as he approached the central portion. To my beloved children, Julian Vance and Clara Vance, I leave the entirety of the controlling shares in Vance Pharmaceuticals, along with the primary residence located in Greenwich, Connecticut, and its surrounding acreage." A collective sigh of relief, almost audible, swept through the front row. Julian actually permitted himself a small, triumphant smirk. Clara gave a slight, grateful nod to the lawyer. They had won the expected prize. They expected me to stand up, offer a quiet congratulations, and perhaps quietly excuse myself to return to my tastefully decorated, but now essentially empty house. Then Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again, a much deeper, more serious sound this time. He turned a page, and the mood in the room instantly chilled. "However," he continued, his voice steady but weighty, "due to certain codicils added and ratified in an amendment dated February 3rd of this year, the disposition of certain other assets requires further clarification." Julian leaned forward, his triumphant smirk vanishing. "Codicils? What other assets, Henderson? Everything significant was accounted for in the trust." Mr. Henderson ignored him, his gaze finding mine for the briefest, most unsettling second before returning to the document. "To my son, Julian Vance, and my daughter, Clara Vance, I bequeath the sum of $1 each to be paid upon execution of this reading." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just shock. It was the sound of expensive equilibrium shattering. Julian's mouth actually dropped open. Clara's perfect posture finally cracked, her spine seeming to slump an inch. That's a joke, isn't it? Julian managed, his voice unnaturally high. Henderson, read that again. I read it precisely as Mr. Vance intended, Julian, the lawyer stated flatly. He tapped the parchment. He explicitly stated that this token amount was compensation for perceived neglect. Clara finally spoke, her voice laced with sudden, venomous anger. Neglect! We devoted our lives to building his legacy. Mother was the one who couldn't be bothered to attend board dinners. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles white. I hadn't expected anything, not really, but hearing Robert publicly punish them felt like a strange, delayed vindication. Mr. Henderson raised a hand for silence, waiting for the tremor in the room to subside. The bulk of the remaining estate, encompassing several private investment portfolios, the collection of rare timepieces, and the controlling interest in our private Cayman Shell Corporation, assets valued conservatively at just under $300 million, is bequeathed in its entirety to one beneficiary. He paused, letting the tension build, savoring the moment. Julian and Clara were leaning so far forward now, their faces pale masks of raw avarice and disbelief. To Eleanor Vance, Mr. Henderson announced, his voice booming with finality. My wife. Julian surged to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a loud scrape. No, that's impossible. She was barely married to him for 20 years. We were his blood. Clara was frozen, her eyes wide, staring at me as if I had materialized from the woodwork. I hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. I was Eleanor. The quiet background noise suddenly handed the entire orchestra. Mr. Henderson calmly retrieved Julian's fallen chair and placed it upright. There is, however, a final stipulation attached to this transfer, an instruction that must be followed to finalize the estate. He looked pointedly at my perfectly composed, suddenly very wealthy children. Mrs. Vance, the will requires you to disclose the contents of the safety deposit box held jointly in your name at the First National Bank within 48 hours of probate commencement, before you can fully assume control of the liquid assets. If you refuse, the entire estate reverts to the charities listed previously. The scraping sound of the chair Julian had knocked over seemed to echo endlessly in the sudden, deafening silence. His face, usually a picture of controlled superiority, was contorted into something ugly, a mixture of shock and incandescent rage. Clara remained seated, but the rigidity in her spine had been replaced by a frightening stillness, the kind of calm before a catastrophic storm breaks. A safety deposit box? Julian finally spat out, his voice raw. What the hell is in a safety deposit box that's worth $300 million? You haven't gone to a bank in 10 years, Mother. You buy your trinkets at local craft fairs. His contempt was so ingrained, so automatic, that even the seismic shift in his financial standing couldn't stop it. It was a reflex, and it wounded me more than the inheritance might heal. Robert gave me that box 10 years ago, Julian, I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. The shock of hearing my name attached to that staggering sum had somehow anchored me. I felt detached, watching the scene unfold as if viewing a particularly dramatic foreign film. Clara pushed herself up, moving with a predatory grace that belied her shock. She advanced toward the desk, bypassing me entirely. Mr. Henderson, this is clearly coercion. Father was ill. He was manipulated. Mother has no knowledge of any significant assets outside the household allowance he provided. Tell us what's in that box. Mr. Henderson leaned back, seemingly enjoying the crumbling of their perfectly constructed worlds. I am merely the executor, Miss Vance. The document is explicit. The box must be opened by Eleanor, and its contents revealed to the named parties, you two, before the transfer is ratified. Failure to comply means the entire estate goes to the National Wildlife Fund. Robert was quite clear on his disdain for the petty squabbles that ensue over material wealth, though he certainly enjoyed setting the stage for one last performance. Disdain? Julian roared, throwing his hands up. He just signed over our futures to the woman who spent the last decade cataloging antique teacups. I finally stood, smoothing down the simple wool skirt I wore. It felt strange to stand up in this room. Usually I was an accessory, an object to be admired or ignored. Today, I was the epicenter. The teacups paid for your first semester at Wharton, Julian, I said quietly. And the dinners Clara enjoyed while studying late? Those were cooked by me. Don't try to play the martyr now, Eleanor, Clara hissed, turning her fury onto me. You knew he was slipping. You've been whispering in his ear, haven't you? What did you put in that stupid box? Undisclosed property, gold bars. Is this some blackmail scheme? The accusation hung heavy. They couldn't reconcile the meek wife with the sudden multi-millionaire. They needed a villain, and I was the only viable candidate left standing. It's not blackmail, Clara, I said, taking a slow step toward the desk. It's closure. Something you two haven't offered me in years. I looked at Mr. Henderson. I will open the box tomorrow morning. Julian intercepted me as I tried to move toward the door, placing a hand heavily on my shoulder. His grip was strong, demanding compliance. You're not going anywhere until we know precisely what you've hidden. If you have anything that rightfully belongs to the company, to us, you hand it over now. I looked down at his hand, then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. The decade of silence, of swallowed pride, fueled a sudden, terrifying clarity. I gently removed his hand. Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a register I hadn't used since before I married his father. A voice that commanded attention, not asked for it. If you touch me again without my permission, I will have you investigated for every under-the-table deal you've ever made in your gilded little career. You want to see what's in the box? Fine. But understand this. You have no idea what kind of woman Robert married, and you certainly don't know the woman you're standing in front of now. I turned and walked out, leaving them frozen in their ruinous inheritance, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. The drive home was a blur. The chauffeur, usually instructed to stick to quiet routes, was directed by me to take the fastest way back to the mansion. The house felt enormous, cold, and accusing. I bypassed the main living areas and went straight to the small, hidden study off the library, Robert's sanctuary, and more recently, mine. I found the key where he always kept it, tucked inside the hollowed-out base of a bronze clock he never wound. The key was heavy, cold brass, stamped with the logo of the First National Bank. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark study, running my thumb over the intricate grooves of the key, waiting for dawn. The phone calls started around 11 p.m. Julian first, pleading, then threatening. Clara called later, her tone switching wildly between crocodile tears and thinly veiled threats of legal maneuvers to have me declared mentally incompetent. I let them go to voicemail. I needed to prepare, not for the money, but for the contents. Robert didn't leave me a collection of jewels or secret bearer bonds. He left me a legacy, a final weapon, and I had a terrible feeling it was aimed squarely at the two people who had spent years treating me as if I were less than invisible. As the first weak light of morning filtered through the study window, I finally understood why he'd kept the key separate, why the codicil was so specific. He hadn't just left me the wealth, he'd forced me to expose the truth that justified it. By 8 a.m., I was in the town car heading downtown. I bypassed the usual grand entrance and went directly to the private banking floor. My appearance alone caused a ripple of immediate hushed attention. Mrs. Vance, rarely seen unaccompanied, suddenly looking composed and formidable. The manager, Mr. Davies, led me directly to the vault, looking more nervous than I felt. Julian and Clara were waiting inside the small, sterile room adjacent to the safety deposit area. They must have bribed someone or used a back channel. They were both dressed impeccably, radiating dangerous confidence. "Mother," Julian began, stepping forward before the manager could lock the door, "we've agreed on a figure. We will offer you $10 million cash, no questions asked, if you sign over the box contents to us right now and agree to a settlement on the estate." Clara added, her voice tight, "Think about it, Eleanor. Litigation will destroy the family name. $10 million is yours, quietly, today. Fight us, and we will tear apart every transaction Robert ever made, and you will spend the rest of your life in court defending him and yourself." I walked past them both, my eyes fixed on the single, unassuming metal door of Deposit Box 712. I slid the key into the lock, the click unnervingly loud. I pushed the drawer open and pulled out the contents, not looking at Julian or Clara, but at the two manila envelopes sitting inside. They were thick, heavy, and sealed with red wax, bearing Robert's personal signet ring. I picked up the first envelope, the one addressed to Mr. Henderson. I glanced at Julian and Clara, whose breathing had become shallow, expectant. They thought it was financial poison. They thought it was a deed to an offshore island. I broke the seal on the envelope labeled "For the Executor." Inside, there were stacks of photographs, dozens of them, and a sheaf of official-looking documents. I pulled out the top photograph. It wasn't a picture of Robert. It was a picture of a young woman, about 20 years old, with my eyes, laughing in a summer field, and next to her, a very young Robert. I looked up at Julian and Clara, their faces hardening as they saw the unfamiliar, intimate photographs. "These are not about money," I whispered, my voice cracking slightly. "These are about the truth." I picked up the second envelope, the one addressed solely to me. The paper felt thinner, almost like legal tissue. I opened it, pulling out a single folded document. It wasn't a deed or a codicil. It was a birth certificate. The name on the certificate was Thomas Vance, and the mother listed was Eleanor Vance. Below that, the father was listed as Robert Vance. Thomas Vance was my son. The son they never knew existed. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the date of birth, 10 years before I married Robert, and the location, a small private adoption agency record that had been sealed by court order, a secret kept for decades. Robert hadn't been denying me. He'd been protecting him. And the final line scrawled in Robert's shaky handwriting at the bottom of the certificate was the real killer. Thomas is the true heir to the Vance bloodline and the beneficiary of the original Vance Trust, established 1985. Julian gasped, stumbling backward, knocking a chair over again. "That's a lie. I'm the eldest. I'm the heir." I looked at the certificate again, focusing on the final devastating detail. The adoption agency listed was not the one where I supposedly gave up my firstborn. It was the agency where Julian and Clara had been adopted from their previous, much less wealthy foster families 25 years ago in a frantic bid to secure Robert a suitable family unit. The room spun. Robert hadn't left me the money because he loved me. He'd left me the money because I was the only one who knew the foundation of their entire identity. Their very existence as Vance children was built on a carefully managed, decades-long deception. And now I held the proof that they weren't his blood at all. The world tilted on its axis inside that sterile vault room. Julian, the man who prided himself on meticulous due diligence and an impenetrable grasp on legacy, looked like he'd been physically struck. His skin had gone the color of bleached parchment, and he was hyperventilating, clutching at the mahogany edge of the document table. Clara, the brilliant surgeon accustomed to dealing with the fragility of the human body, seemed to momentarily forget how to breathe. Her eyes, locked on the faded ink of the adoption papers, betrayed a confusion so profound it eclipsed her usual icy control. "No," Julian choked out, his voice barely a rasp. "This is forged. Henderson, tell them this is forged." Mr. Henderson, who had watched the entire exchange with a terrifying neutrality, merely adjusted his cufflink. "I assure you, Mr. Vance, the documents within Box 712 were cross-referenced against sealed probate records retained by the firm since 1995. They are entirely authentic. Robert Vance took great pains to ensure their veracity." The silence returned, heavy with the weight of obliterated self-worth. They weren't just disinherited, they were revealed as imposters in their own lives. I carefully refolded the birth certificate of Thomas Vance, the ghost son who was now, apparently, the rightful heir to everything they believed was theirs. Then I looked at my children, the children I had raised, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose anxieties I had soothed when Robert was too busy building empires to notice, and I felt a flicker of something dangerous: power. "He didn't just leave me the money, Julian," I said, my voice regaining its low, steady timbre. "He left me the truth. You two spent your lives trying to earn his approval, trying to become the perfect Vance heirs. You never once considered why you needed his approval so desperately." Clara finally found her voice, and it was sharp, honed steel. "You kept this from us, all this time. You knew. You married him knowing he had a legitimate son, and you let us believe we were everything?" "I knew nothing until 5 months ago, Clara," I countered, "when Robert called me into this office, the very one we are standing in now, and laid out the evidence. He told me he'd been tracking Thomas for years. He told me he had manipulated our adoption process to ensure you both had the education and pedigree he felt you deserved as a replacement for the son he couldn't keep." Julian's composure finally snapped. He lunged, not toward me, but toward the table, sweeping his arm across the surface, scattering the photographs and legal documents everywhere. "You are lying. I saw you in the office, Mother. You were nothing. A social climber who got lucky. You never had secrets." "And you, Julian, are right," I conceded, stepping back as the papers fluttered to the floor. "I was nothing. Until Robert decided that his real heir was too complicated, too messy, too real to inherit his clean corporate legacy. Thomas lives abroad, runs a small nonprofit, and has no idea he is the Vance heir. Robert intended for me to ensure he was protected, and in return, I got the kingdom." Clara looked down at the scattered images, photos of Robert and a young woman, her presumed mother, looking startlingly like me, and her composure broke. Tears began to track paths through the expensive powder on her cheeks. He used us. He bought us. And you just sat there playing the quiet wife, knowing all along that we were just placeholders? I played the role you required, I corrected her. You wanted a wife who stayed out of the way of your ambitions. You got one. Now the rules have changed. Mr. Henderson, ever the pragmatic facilitator, finally intervened, moving with surprising agility to gather the scattered papers, putting the vital birth certificate safely back into the manila envelope addressed to me. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone shifting subtly from legal formality to something approaching respect. "The terms are set. You are the controlling beneficiary. What is your next instruction?" I looked at Julian, who was slumped against the wall, defeated. I looked at Clara, whose face was a ruin of betrayal and fear. They had spent their lives striving for perfection, and now their foundation was dust. "My next instruction," I stated clearly, meeting Mr. Henderson's eyes, "is that you immediately contact Thomas Vance. I want him flown in on a private jet by tomorrow evening. He needs to understand his actual inheritance." Julian pushed himself off the wall, his eyes burning with a new, terrifying resolve. "You bring that stranger here? You invite some street urchin into our father's house? We'll stop you, Eleanor. We have lawyers. We will tie this up in probate for a decade. You won't see a penny." "You misunderstand the situation, Julian," I said, picking up the second sealed envelope, the one clearly marked for me. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "I don't need the money right now. Robert made sure of that. I need to ensure the true heir knows who he is." I stopped at the door, turning back to face the wreckage of their expectations. "But before I call Thomas, I need one more piece of information from this box that Robert made me promise to retrieve only after you two witnessed the adoption papers." I held up the sealed envelope addressed to myself. This second envelope contains the original, handwritten confession from the private investigator Robert hired 30 years ago, the one who confirmed your biological origins. It details every lie, every payment made to cover up the adoption records, and every threat Robert issued to keep this quiet. I looked directly at Clara, whose face was now ashen. "You want to fight me in court, Clara? You want to tear down the family name? Fine. But if you open that door, I don't just expose that you aren't Robert's biological children. I expose that the woman you both worshipped, your birth mother, actually consented to the adoption in exchange for a substantial payment, a payment that was never disclosed to Robert. And I will show everyone the signed receipt, proving you knew about it 2 years ago and paid her off to keep quiet." Clara froze mid-gasp. Julian's head snapped up, staring at his sister with dawning horror. They looked at each other, the perfect siblings, suddenly united only by a shared terrible secret that was about to be revealed to the entire world, courtesy of their quiet, overlooked mother. "Now," I concluded, placing the sealed document back into the box and locking it with a definitive thunk, "tell me again how you plan to stop me from welcoming your older brother home." The silence that followed my final declaration was so dense, it felt physically suffocating. Julian and Clara weren't looking at me anymore. They were staring at each other, their faces mirroring the slow-motion horror of realizing they had just been implicated in a massive, decades-long conspiracy they thought they'd escaped. Clara's breath hitched, a small, ugly sound. You wouldn't. That receipt? It proves nothing about us. It just proves Mother was greedy. Greedy enough to take money from Robert to keep you quiet about your adoption, I finished smoothly, the cold control never wavering. But the document implicates you both, Clara, because you were the one who corresponded with her after Robert's initial settlement. You were terrified he'd find out you were digging into your own past. The documentation proves you paid her an additional annuity last year to ensure her silence about the original terms that included the explicit understanding that if Robert ever chose to acknowledge Thomas, you would forfeit any future claim to the Vance name, having actively attempted to bury the truth. Julian stepped forward, his veneer of aggression completely stripped away, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. That's a lie. We never spoke to her after the initial contact. That's a fabrication, Eleanor. You're insane. Am I? I smiled, a genuine, chilling smile that held no warmth. Mr. Henderson, if you would be so kind, I believe the original investigator's notes reference the bank where that annuity transfer was processed, the same bank where Clara manages her primary medical trust. Mr. Henderson nodded curtly, pulling a small, leather-bound ledger from his briefcase. He flipped through it rapidly. The transfer, dated August 14th of last year, was routed through a Cayman account registered to Clara Vance's personal charitable foundation, Mrs. Vance. It was labeled, quite innocuously, as a research grant. Clara looked like she was about to faint, leaning heavily against the wall. She had been so careful, so utterly assured of her own brilliance in navigating legal and financial loopholes, that she had left a paper trail visible to anyone who knew where to look. And Robert had known exactly where to look, directing the trail straight to me. "You see, children," I said, my voice softening with a mock sorrow that made the accusation sting deeper. I never needed the money. Robert gave me the estate to ensure I had the resources and the platform to protect the real family. But he gave me the evidence against you two to ensure you couldn't touch the legacy or the truth, for as long as I chose to remain silent. Julian stared at the floor, his world reduced to a single agonizing point. He was adopted, and his sister had known enough to try and buy off their biological mother for a secret that was now public knowledge in this small room. "So, what now?" Julian mumbled, the fight draining out of him. "You ruin us. You bring in this stranger, Thomas, and he takes everything. Is that it? Revenge?" I walked toward the door again, feeling the immense weight of the key in my pocket. "It's not revenge, Julian. It's correction. Robert spent his life trying to manage appearances. I'm simply managing the reality he left behind." I opened the vault door. Mr. Henderson stepped out, leaving Julian and Clara alone in the small room with the scattered photos and the ghost of their fabricated past. "My instruction to you, Mr. Henderson," I said, pausing on the threshold, my voice projecting back into the room, "is to contact the private jet service immediately. Flight coordinates to Geneva for Thomas Vance, and prepare the press release for tomorrow morning regarding the estate transfer, highlighting the Vance commitment to transparency and family values." As I turned to walk away, I heard Clara's voice, sharp and desperate, echoing from the vault. "Wait, Eleanor, if you bring him here, if you take everything, what about us? What happens when Thomas realizes we tried to expose you? What if he decides to fight you?" I stopped, my hand hovering over the cool steel of the elevator button. I paused for a long moment, letting the tension mount, letting them stew in the knowledge that their carefully constructed lives were now entirely dependent on my mercy. "That," I said, not turning around, pressing the button that would take me far away from them, "is where the next chapter begins. Because, children, I told you I needed to retrieve everything from that box. I only showed you the first envelope." The elevator doors started to glide open, revealing the plush carpet of the bank lobby beyond. "The second envelope," I continued, my voice now a low murmur, "just for myself. The one addressed to me. It contains the documentation that proves Robert Vance was not only aware of the adoption cover-up but actively financed the operation to ensure neither of you ever discovered your true parentage, and that he designated me as the executor of the secret in case he died, with one specific instruction. If Julian or Clara ever attempted to legally contest the will, this second envelope is to be mailed directly to the SEC. It details every instance of insider trading, every bribed official, and every illegal offshore maneuver that built Vance Pharmaceuticals from the ground up. The doors slid open fully, revealing the bright, oblivious lobby. I stepped out, leaving the two newly disinherited heirs trapped in the vault, realizing that not only had they lost their fortune, but their mother now held the key to their criminal prosecution. And I hadn't even decided yet whether Thomas would get the company or if I would simply burn the whole rotten structure down around them. The silence from the vault room was instantaneous and absolute once the elevator doors closed between us. The gilded cage had suddenly become an airtight trap. I knew, without needing to hear their panicked whispers, that Julian and Clara were processing the true nature of their predicament. The inheritance was a secondary issue. Their immediate survival depended entirely on their obedience. I rode the elevator down slowly, savoring the descent. For years I had lived under the weight of their disapproval, the suffocating expectations of perfection. Now the weight had shifted, and it rested squarely on their shoulders. Back in the town car, I finally pulled out my phone, bypassing Mr. Henderson's number. I dialed a number Robert had given me years ago, tucked away on a heavily encrypted satellite phone he insisted I keep in the study safe, explaining it was for emergencies only. It rang twice before a calm, slightly accented voice answered. "Yes?" "It's Eleanor Vance," I said, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window. "I need to speak to Thomas." There was a distinct intake of breath on the other end. "Mrs. Vance? I am Marcus, Thomas's associate. He is currently in the field. Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to become exponentially better for him," I replied. "Tell him to clear his schedule. I have a legacy to discuss. And tell him to book a flight to New York, first class, but he should bring casual clothing. No suits required." I hung up, already feeling the stress of decades easing from my shoulders. The immediate task was complete. The power dynamic had been inverted, and the path was cleared for the true heir. I spent the next 6 hours in my study, the same room where Robert had shattered my predictable life, organizing the materials from Box 712. I didn't review the SEC documents. I didn't need to. I knew Robert's meticulous accounting. They were ready to deploy if necessary, but I held them in reserve. My primary focus was the life I was about to facilitate for Thomas. The calls from Julian and Clara started again late that afternoon. They bypassed the legal threats and went straight to frantic pleading, channeled through Mr. Henderson. The lawyer called me personally around 5 p.m., his voice tired but professional. "Mrs. Vance, Julian, and Clara are requesting a meeting. They have verbally agreed to a full cessation of litigation and will cooperate fully with the transfer of assets to Mr. Thomas Vance, provided you guarantee the SEC documents remain sealed." "They agree to the terms?" I asked. "They do. In fact, Julian is offering to resign immediately from his board seat at Vance Holdings and hand over his voting shares to whomever you designate, provided you assure them that their personal finances, outside of the company structure, will not be scrutinized." "A prudent move," I commented. "Tell them I accept their resignation, effective immediately. They are to vacate the Greenwich residence by the end of the week, and they will receive their $1 checks as stipulated in the will." "And the SEC documents?" Mr. Henderson pressed. "They remain sealed, Mr. Henderson, for now. Their continued silence and compliance are contingent upon the integrity of that seal. Should they attempt to harass Thomas or try to challenge my authority as executor in any way, the package goes to the Securities and Exchange Commission by the next sunrise." The finality in my voice seemed to resonate even through the phone line. The corporation Robert built on deceit would now pass, relatively cleanly, to the son who knew nothing of its dark origins. The next evening, the atmosphere in the mansion was vastly different. The police had discreetly escorted Julian and Clara from the property earlier that afternoon, carrying only what they could fit in 2 suitcases, a far cry from the empires they thought they commanded. The house was quiet, waiting. I stood in the vast, echoing entrance hall, wearing a simple black dress, waiting for Thomas. A sleek black sedan pulled up the sweeping drive, followed by a much smaller, unassuming car, Thomas's own, I presumed. Marcus emerged first, looking slightly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Vance estate. Then Thomas stepped out. He was tall, perhaps 35, with a kind, weathered face that held Robert's strong jawline, but lacked his father's predatory sharpness. He looked around the imposing architecture with a mixture of awe and caution. When his eyes met mine, there was no suspicion, only a deep, inherent trust. He walked toward me slowly. "Mrs. Vance," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I still can't quite grasp what Marcus told me. My biological father left me this." "He did, Thomas," I confirmed, extending my hand, this time offering genuine warmth. "He left you everything. He also left me a very specific set of instructions on how to clean house before handing over the keys." I didn't mention Julian or Clara. Not yet. That was a chapter for another day, perhaps when Thomas was settled, when he could wield the truth as a shield, not a burden. As we walked into the study where the faint scent of old paper still lingered, I placed the key to box 712 in his hand. "This is the key to your past, Thomas," I said. "Everything you need to know about how you came to be is in there. But first, you need to know about your future." I gestured toward the massive oak desk, which now seemed more like a throne. "The company is yours. The money is yours. The legacy is yours." "But Thomas," I met his gaze, my eyes steady and resolute, "I didn't just inherit this house to give it away. I inherited it to clean it out, and I need you to tell me before we begin tomorrow morning what your first official act as CEO of Vance Holdings will be." Thomas looked at the desk, then at the antique clock on the mantel, the one whose base held the key to the adoption confession. He was silent for a long moment, absorbing the sudden, overwhelming reality of his new life. He finally turned to me, a faint, determined smile touching his lips. "My first act," he said, placing the key back on the desk, "will be to call my 2 adoptive siblings. I want to know why they kept the truth from me for so long, and why my mother gave up the only leverage she had to keep them in line.